Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome aboard. This is your captain speaking, Debbie Buyaki, and today we're taking a flight over Nature's View, kicking off from Nairobi and landing in Toronto, Canada. Quite a long haul flight today, and I hope you enjoy this climate journey story. Carry your scarves and warm sweaters, and as usual, seatbelts on and wheels up. It's kind of interesting to interview your friend and co-lead, but here goes. My guest today is an environmental advocate based in Toronto, Canada. She is a youth ambassador of Stop Ecocide International Canada and is co-lead of Stop Ecocide's global youth movement. That's Youth for Ecocide Law. She has represented Stop Ecocide International at various global speaking engagements, including ELCOI Canada, side events for the Convention of Biological Diversity, that's COP15, UN Water 2023 conference, COP28, and all the good things she's done. Beyond the Stop Ecocide movement, she's a tree planter, a climate strike organizer, a webinar in Google, docs guru, and all the good things that come with her. So guest, please introduce yourself. That's your super cool name. How's the weather and what you're currently taking?
My name's Amalie. I'm in Toronto, Canada. The weather is pretty warm for this time of year. It's around 0 degrees Celsius, so not too bad. It's been more sunny than usual for the past couple days. Yeah, and what I'm currently eating. Right now, I'm just having a cup of tea.
Today we're going to talk about matters law and legal corridors, how the law too can be used to protect our planet, its people, its ecosystems and biodiversity and future, everything legal. Taking it from the top, before we get into all these legalities, let's start with some definitions to my guest. So what is ecocide and when was this word first used?
Ecocide largely just refers to the worst forms of environmental destruction, and it was first used actually to describe what the American troops were doing during the Vietnam War. It was described or used by a biophysicist named Arthur Galston, and his research was taken by the US to develop the kind of weapon of war, Agent Orange. And this is a chemical weapon that was used to cause mass deforestation and as a tactic of war in Vietnam by the US military. So Galston used this term to describe what was happening on the ground. And then it was used again during the Stockholm Conference on the human environment. And after that, it continued to get used a bit more by scholars to describe mass environmental destruction. But yeah, really it emerged out of that kind of acute use for a specific purpose. And increasingly since then, ecocide has been a term to encompass what is going on around the globe. So all the kind of irreversible, widespread, or long-term environmental destruction that we see on a daily basis.
All right, and I will attach the legal definition that was given in 2021 on what ecocide would be described as if it would pass as a law. It also has a bit of its roots in Greek and Latin, and it is literally translated to kill one's home, and which is more or less what she just said. And when we talk about ecocide, what is International Criminal Court, and how do these two cross paths?
So the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, is considered the world's highest court for international criminal law. It's this global court that tries what are considered atrocity crimes, or the world's worst crimes. And right now it has 4 crimes under its purview within its founding document, the Rome Statute. Those are genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of aggression. Now, when the Rome Statute was first being drafted, more crimes were included. And one thing that was being considered was ecocide. And it's increasingly understood that that was removed in one of the final drafts pretty abruptly. Now, my understanding of it, or at least my intuition of it, is that great powers, especially countries like the US that often are more susceptible to being tried for things like environmental destruction, were likely scared to include it. But since then, really, there's been a growing movement that's recognized that, environmental destruction threatens many, many lives around the world, and it needs to be considered on the same level as these other crimes, because it is absolutely a threat to all of our fundamental human rights. And so there is a growing movement now to make ecocide the fifth crime at the International Criminal Court. This was initially proposed by a bunch of different scholars, but it really became a social movement after the barrister Polly Higgins decided that this was something that needed to become accessible to the wider public and began the Stop Ecocide movement with Jojo Mehta. So they founded this movement, and to this day, it's continuing to grow and continuing to gather speed around the world as a way to hold the perpetrators accountable for the worst forms of environmental destruction. So looking at CEOs and government officials who enable the mass destruction of the earth.
Right, that's such a detailed answer. So I think it's a bit crazy that ecocide was removed, but we see the reason why. And ecocide is being proposed as a fifth crime. I know it's all the other four crimes are crimes against peace, and they're charged during wartime. But ecocide is being proposed as a standalone crime that can be charged during peace times and war times, which is quite great for those loopholes that come with criminal law at times. But anyway, we're not about to go there. And to some extent, all this seem far-fetched with the ICC and all those legal terms and legalities. How do local jurisdictions come in on this?
I mean, one of the cool things about the ICC is that it's one state, one vote, which means that there are 123 countries that are part of the International Criminal Court, and no matter the size of the country or its geopolitical power, it has the same amount of power within the ICC to vote. So a new crime comes about when one state proposes a new amendment to the Rome Statute. Initially, the proposal would be considered if half of the countries vote in favor. Then it'll go through a process of debate and amendment. And at the end of the day, the really key figure is that we need 2/3 of the countries that are part of the court to vote yes to include this new crime. After that, any country that signs on to the new crime would be able to be bound by it. But I think individual countries come in because, A, we need their votes. And the International Criminal Court is a court of last resort. That's what it's called, which essentially means that it isn't used until a country is unable or unwilling to try its own perpetrators. So if ecocide were to become an international crime, any country that signs on would then have an obligation to also make it a domestic crime. And that means that for me, like a country like Canada would pass its own law against ecocide. And then when a CEO in Canada committed ecocide, we would expect the Canadian courts to hold this person accountable. If they couldn't or they didn't, then the ICC could step in and indict them. And that's where kind of this global movement comes in. We have a lot of teams in different countries around the world who are lobbying individual governments and are trying to build support on the ground because we need as many countries as possible. And some countries are really leading the way on this, especially small island developing states who are most impacted by climate change and want to see legal solutions. So Vanuatu has been a really big leader on making this a crime. For obvious reasons, Vanuatu is highly impacted by climate change and has almost contributed nothing to the problem that we're facing. And increasingly, a bunch of other states are starting to voice support, especially the European Union has now announced that it'll include crimes comparable to ecocide in its European Crime Directive. And then parliaments in countries like Brazil are now considering ecocide legislation.
And if you're interested in learning the deep matters about it, I will just brush through it, but this proposed bill by the state of Vanuatu will go through 4 stages: proposal, admissibility, adoption, and ratification. It's exactly what she said. Any of the 123 state parties of the RIM statute may propose an amendment. Then in admissibility, this requires a majority of those present and voting at the next meeting of state or parties after the proposal is submitted take a stand. Then we come into adoption. This is where at least two-thirds of the states, which is 2/3 of 123, around 82 states, take a vote and support or drop the amendment. Then the ratification, which is exactly why it comes into jurisdictions and into national legislation in some sense. I will try to attach the Stop Ecocide and Youth for Ecocide Law digital toolkit if you're really interested in these matters. But if you're just brushing through, let's go to the next question. How are youth involved in this? And how can they use this law as a way to defend their futures?
I mean, youth have played an increasing role, and Debbie is a really big part of this and always undersells her role in it. So I'm definitely going to talk about that a little bit. But a couple years back, around the Stockholm Plus 50 International Conference, it became increasingly clear that the global youth movement for climate action was frustrated. Was frustrated with the lack of action that governments were taking to solve critical environmental crises. We were frustrated with the lack of accountability mechanisms to hold our leaders accountable when they violate their commitments and threaten our futures. And one of the solutions that really emerged as important among a lot of global youth was criminalizing ecocide and being able to create that legal mechanism to hold our leaders accountable when they fail. And so after that, we founded the Youth for Ecocide Law Network. And this is part of the larger Stop Ecocide International movement, which advocates to make ecocide an international crime, which is leading the push forward. And the Youth Network really represents the young people who are going to be most impacted by environmental destruction today and their futures. So our youth constituency does a ton of work. A lot of it is raising awareness around the world, trying to bring more youth into the fold, get their ideas, and continue to bring momentum forward. We've been operating for about 2 years now, which has been phenomenal. And I was co-leading the network for a lot of those 2 years. And recently I've stepped down for a couple of reasons, but one of the reasons is that we've grown so much in the past couple of years, and it's been amazing to see how many youth are gravitating towards this way to defend our futures. And I'm so excited to see how other voices bring this forward, because it's really become a more autonomous movement. But when people ask me why this idea is attractive to youth, and they ask me this a lot because it seems like a legal idea, I think the answer is pretty clear to me. And it's that right now in our laws, we have almost no way to protect the rights of future generations to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. You know, if you're a company, your profit incentive and your legal requirements are to create as much value for your shareholders today. If you're a government, you want to create money and good opportunities for your population today. And there really isn't any legal structure for saying, okay, but we also need to think about the access that future generations have to their human rights. And an ecocide law includes mass environmental destruction with long-term implications, which means that if a government official or a CEO, corporate perpetrator, makes a decision that's going to irreversibly harm future generations, you know, like causing mass industrial emissions that exacerbate climate change or destroying a critical ecosystem and harming the last of specific species, well, then they can be held accountable for that today. And we can say, you know what, we're not going to accept you destroying our future. We're going to stand up. And a ton of youth have gravitated towards that as something really tangible we can do right now to change the direction that the world is going.
Right. I think it puts the power in those who will be on the planet for the long term, as opposed to guys who are making decisions and don't think of the impacts it will have in the next 20 to 30 years, which is our future. So I think this law as well puts that power in your hands. Mean, go ahead.
One thing that I forgot to say there was that in the past, I guess, half of a year or so, a lot of more regional work in terms of the youth network has started to happen. And specifically last summer, Debbie and a couple other folks started the first regional Youth for Ecocide Law campaign in Africa. And it's doing a ton of great work on the ground. So one way that this movement is continuing to grow is by trying to establish more regional campaigns. But Debbie's doing phenomenal work on that and will be co-leading the youth network with Leia going forward. And they're just both amazing activists, and I'm so psyched to see what they do with it.
Oh my gosh, thanks. So I think the reason we started going into regions was the differences in the ecocidal acts that happen across the world and the need to contextualize this message to different audiences and languages and actors as well, to try understand that this is happening here. It's not happening in Europe, but this still could be potentially ecocide. This is 2024, and we're hoping this bill will come in as soon as it can, maybe before the time bomb of 2030. The last crime under the Rome Statute, which is the crime of aggression, took 7 years, but we're hoping to beat that maybe 4 years or less. And get some wheels rolling and some prison cells full. Haha. Anyway, moving now to the cross section of the law and rights. What is the meeting point of this law, the ecocide law, and rights of nature?
I love to talk about this because, as you know, the rights of nature movement is also growing really rapidly around the world. And it's not a new concept. Indigenous groups around the world have been recognizing that nature has inherent rights for centuries, but it is a new idea in a lot of legal systems. And so the notion of rights of nature is really just, okay, the natural world has a right not to be destroyed. It's not just humans that have rights. Other living beings also deserve some standing. And so there's a growing movement to recognize that there are certain rights that we should accord living systems, living beings like animals, ecosystems like rainforests, things like rivers, and so on. And as we're beginning to recognize these rights of nature, there comes a really important question. And it's, how do you actually protect those rights? So in this way, ecocide law and rights of nature are two sides of the same coin, You establish the rights of nature normatively to say we can't massively destroy the natural world because, we as humans also depend on it. We drink its air, we drink its water, we breathe its air, we eat food grown from the natural world. We are part of the natural world. And then ecocide law comes in and says, okay, let's enforce the right of nature not to be massively destroyed. Let's actually create parameters in which nature can thrive for the long term and we don't massively destroy the planet. So yeah, I'm really excited because they're kind of two very complementary legal solutions that are advancing in tandem right now.
I think, as you mentioned as well, there needs to be some foundational ground that you can put up a right, but what is the backup? So this law, in a sense, is the backup plan. When those rights are violated, there is a law that says this will happen if you don't uphold this right. So it's like two sides of the same coin. One is the policy side, in a sense, and one is the upholder of that policy. Anyways, this is just the intricacies of the legal sides, and maybe we'll have a more in-depth conversation one day. But now as we wind down, and I'm thinking we might have someone else come talk about almost the same process that's happening in the world's highest court, that's the ICJ. And it's something that's also being led by the state of Vanuatu that we're super proud of for starting this. But hey, let me not preempt that. Now as we wind down and having all this avenues that we can use to protect ourselves, our futures, our life forms and biodiversities, forests and everything nice that we have on Earth, what is your hope?
That's a good question. And sometimes when we have these international discussions about environmental problems, it can be tough to find hope because you run into so many leaders or quote unquote leaders of countries that just simply don't care or that are more motivated by making a quick buck than by actually solving environmental problems. And you have companies that continue to violate human rights and environmental rights over and over again. I see this all the time in Canada because we house so many mining companies and we're fighting for our government to actually hold them accountable. But, these mining companies are doing terrible things over and over again, and it's hard to have hope. But what I do find hope in is people and movements. And so ecocide law, this movement was one of the first things that really gave me hope because it was such a tangible way to hold those most responsible accountable. We know that environmental destruction is not caused by everyone. It's caused by a small number of people, specifically leaders and the ultra-rich, people who have disproportionate power. And it gives me a lot of hope to see how this movement is growing. But it also gives me hope to kind of run into other activists who are doing just amazing things with new ideas and pushing the movements forward around the world. So another one that gives me a ton of hope is the movement for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which essentially is an agreement not to start any new fossil fuel projects. Yeah, people are doing amazing things, and environmental justice movements around the world are not going to go anywhere because, we have everything to lose, which means that we have everything to gain by taking action. And that gives me hope.
Right. I think when you mentioned how some countries just don't care to some extent on how much their actions contribute to this problem we have, so much reminds me of COP28, and he was very, very difficult to be there sometimes because the discussions were quite tense, but you could see some states were there to actually argue for the right to life of their people, but some states were there to, I don't know, just mock that in a sense. So I think you need to find a source of hope and a standpoint to hold on to, and this is to everyone, and fight from that lane, because I think when we're together, everything is possible. So now that I mentioned COP28, I was asked the same question. I was asked to give an intervention on the same question on what gives you hope. And I wrote down something about this law that, well, I'll proceed to read because I think it's still powerful. But hey, this is what I wrote. This law represents what we value and what we want to protect, to preserve, and even regenerate. This law is like a mirror, a reflection of our values and morals as human beings, our deep consciousness, and on the opposite, it also represents our fear. So more so like criminal law, for example, we value life and fear its end, especially when it's abrupt and when it was supposed not to end. So that's why we have a global law that says do not kill. The same way this ecocide law is going to and has already been seen in this type of fear and value type. We at least, and some of us, if not most of us, value our home, our earth, our soil, our trees, and we fear the lack of it. And we fear the death of earth. We fear the hurt of earth. So this law, in a sense, represents what we value and what we fear. It gives me hope that thousands of people across the world, in the EU, in Brazil, in Belgium, and all the other 40 countries that are moving towards this law are supporting it. And it gives me hope that there's more like us out there. It gives me hope that young people across the world are raising their voices and are not willing to quit on defending their futures and their lives. It's a bit of a long thing, but I'll just skip to the end. This law will protect us and what we stand for, what we also want, and for our future generations. It's our legacy on earth to stand on this side of history, the just side of history, the justice side of history. It gives me hope that it will work. And now, standing from the point of the future, trying to look back in a say, I am privileged and happy that I get to be part of the team that is chanting and moving forward to protect and preserve its home. It's the convergence we all have that gives me hope. We have no much time. This law is our hope. And for indigenous communities in the Amazon, in Asia, in Congo, and for the children behind us, it is their only hope. So let this be on the tongues of everyone, to their legislatures. The urgency of its advocation, drafting, passing into local legislation is what we need to aim for. As long as there's life, there's hope. But this life needs to be protected to maintain this hope. There is a lot of good in this world, and it's worth fighting for. That was my intervention, and the crowd went wild. But thank you for coming to this episode, and I'll pass it to you for your last words.
I'm just so happy that you invited me to talk about this, Debbie. I always love the opportunity to chat, and now that we're not working together as closely, I definitely miss these chats.
I know.
But I think on ecocide law, one of the things that really resonated with me when I first heard about it was someone said, your human right to life seems absolutely essential now. And it's enforced by laws against murder. So imagine if you were trying to fight for human rights or even like your own right to life, and there was no law against murder. And I started thinking about that, and they said, that's the problem the environmental movement has today. We're trying to fight to save the planet. We're trying to fight to save every living being, and there's no law to prevent murdering the planet. And that really resonated with me because fundamentally, our laws inform the structure upon which we can actually build a sustainable society. And if we don't prevent the mass destruction of our world, then, how do we go forward? So this law to me could be the start of a really beautiful change. And it's not the whole story. We need a ton of solutions, but it's a critical game changer. And I'm so excited to see it continue to get brought forward.
I would not add anything to that because it's absolutely what is needed and needed really fast to some extent. So thank you for coming and thank you for getting up so early to do this. And I hope to see you on the next flight for Earth.